I want to do a quick video today on an activity from my Better Lesson website. It's the first few days of my functions unit. I just finished this with my classes again this year, and I never cease to be amazed at how beautifully this works. So I just kind of wanted to highlight it because it just really was engaging. Students loved it. They learned so much from it, and it was neat to hear the conversations that my students had based around this lesson. So I'm showing you, I know on my side of the website it looks different, but this is from my Better Lessons unit, the unit on functions. It's the introduction. So I just did this with my 8th grade class, and what it is, it came from the NCTM Illuminations website. It's the activity How Should I Move, which is beautifully written already, but I sort of put my own twist on it using my graphing calculators and this CBR from Texas Instruments, which is wonderful. We have since purchased about 7 of these so that all the math teachers can have one specifically for this unit, functions. So in 8th grade functions, students have to be able to interpret what a graph is telling them, like a story, or sketch a graph of a story, like distances over time, moving away from a certain point and then coming back towards it, and various things that graphs can tell us. So just very quickly, the activity involves graphs. It's all right here on this website. There's a page of graphs, and there's a page like this that is comparing the graphs and getting a summary. So how I do my own twist on it is I give each student group a pair. Usually I have 2 students in a group, and they get a graph pair. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And as you could tell as I scroll down, they become increasingly more difficult for students to understand as you go down the page because they become nonlinear. And in 8th grade and Algebra 1, this works beautifully for both. Students are more familiar with linear because we've been talking linear since 7th grade. So I usually reserve these for my students who usually tend to struggle. And then my students who you usually catch on fairly quickly and need a little bit of a challenge, I give them the later pairs. So I just finished this in my collaboration math class. So these are some students that sometimes don't have a lot of success in math, but they still have some really good common sense, number sense. They can understand the big picture. And this was our first activity back from Christmas break. So I call 3rd quarter the doldrums. The students are kind of burnt out. They kind of see the year starting all over, and they're not terribly motivated or engaged. So I brought out the motion sensor, and we started moving in front of it and graphing and predicting before we moved what the graph was going to look like. And then I asked them, okay, so here's the shape of a graph. Now you tell me, how should the students move? And they loved it, and they said so many brilliant and insightful things. That sometimes it's hard for them to put it on paper, but they can speak math language very well. So what I did was I gave each partnership 2 graphs and a slip of paper, and they had to write what I called walking directions. And they had to write very specific, straightforward directions that I would then collect, jumble up, and pass out to the class for someone else to be able to walk in front of the motion sensor and try to become the graph that was on paper. So it was a competition, which made it even more fun. I gave out prizes to the top teams based on who could write such good instructions that without being able to speak to the other person, all they could do was read it, go in front of the motion sensor, and walk it. They would create the graph with the motion sensor that looked the most like the graph on paper. So here are a few of the pictures that we created, because I always took pictures for judging purposes. And the students usually stood next to the board, but I cropped them out in case any of them would be bothered by being online. There was one pair of graphs. You can see their shoulders. Here was another graph. The really neat thing was about telling them how to walk and then stop, walk and then stop. So the flat no slope made sense to them. Walking towards the motion sensor and then away. Oh, some of them were so insightful about telling the students to slow down in order to curve the graph. And the student had to run very quickly to create his graph. Another one where they told them to walk and then stop, walk and then stop. Using the motion sensor, you'll notice sometimes you have spikes, and that's because they move to the left or to the right, and the motion sensor is very sensitive, and so it was going past them and hitting the wall behind them and then coming back. So we had to have that conversation about being very precise. I lined it up with one of the grout lines in my floor to try to give them a guide. But it was a beautifully executed activity. They did so many wonderful and insightful things. And then when we used this paper to debrief, we could talk about those characteristics of linear versus nonlinear graphs. In 8th grade, they just have to know linear and nonlinear. So we talked about the characteristics of the graphs that identify them as linear graphs and nonlinear, and then the characteristics of the person's motion in front of the sensor to create that shape, that story. What was really cool too was when we were able to talk about which graphs could you not create. And you could not create graph pair 4B, and you could not create 9B. And it was neat for the students to understand and try out a lot of ideas of how to do it and know why they couldn't, because it brings up the conversation about a very major topic. What is a function? What is not a function? How do you know, with the vertical line test that you have a function? So it has gotten us into some really good technical information about the unit from a very hands-on, engaging way, and they loved it. It was a smashing success. I've used it with advanced students. I've used it with struggling students. It always works beautifully. So if you want the full lesson plan, it's in my Better Lessons. It's the Introduction to Functions unit, and it came from NCTM's Illuminations website. I highly recommend it. It always works beautifully. Just make sure you have the CBR and a graphing calculator. Happy teaching!